The Ozark Sisters, who chained their stepbrother in the basement. That's what the court records show happened in 1892, deep in the Missouri hills, where secrets die hard and justice comes with blood on its hands. 3 young women, one monster of a man, and a mother's screams that echoed through the floorboards night after night while their father turned his back and walked away. But when the Magness Sisters finally snapped, they didn't just lock him up. They found men in the woods, wild, broken souls, who understood exactly what kind of punishment fit his crimes. What they did to him in that basement wasn't just revenge. It was something far darker, something that made grown men in town cross themselves when they whispered about it years later. The father knew what was happening down there. The whole holler heard the sounds, yet nobody stopped it. Nobody called for help. What drives sisters to become monsters to stop a monster? And how far will people go when the law won't protect them? The cypress tree had stood for over 200 years before the storm brought it down, its massive trunk crashing through the wraparound porch of the Vance family home like the fist of an angry god. Ara heard the splintering wood from 3 blocks away, where she'd been picking up her grandmother's prescription at what passed for Portan's pharmacy, a cramped corner of Boudreaux's general store that smelled of mothballs and lost hope. The sound cut through the howling wind like a scream, and she knew without looking that something fundamental had changed forever. She ran through streets turned into rivers, her sneakers splashing through ankle-deep water that carried decades of secrets in its murky current. The Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from the remaining trees, and the air tasted of salt and decay. The Gulf pushing inland, reclaiming what had always belonged to it. Portmond was drowning slowly, had been drowning for years, and tonight felt like the final baptism. The house stood half-crushed when she arrived. The ancient cypress lying across it like a sleeping giant, its root ball torn from earth that had held it since before Louisiana was even a state, rose 20 ft into the storm-darkened sky, a cathedral of mud and tangled wood. Ara stared at the destruction, calculating repair costs they couldn't afford, and wondering if this was finally the excuse she needed to move her grandmother to a care facility in Baton Rouge. The guilt of that thought settled in her stomach like a stone. "Sweet Jesus," breathed Mrs. Hebbert from next door, appearing at Ara's shoulder with an umbrella that did nothing against the sideways rain. "That tree's been here since my great-great-grandmother's time. Never seen it so much as lean in a hurricane." Ara nodded absently, her archivist's mind already cataloguing what would need to be salvaged from the wreckage. 27 years of running from this place, and now she was back, trapped by duty and blood in a town that time forgot. Her grandmother's dementia had accelerated rapidly over the past 6 months, turning the sharp-tongued woman who'd raised her into a confused stranger who sometimes looked at her like she was a burglar. The storm began to ease as she circled the fallen giant, assessing the damage. The root ball had torn a crater in the earth deep enough to bury a car, and in its wake lay scattered the detritus of centuries, rusted tools, pottery shards, bits of glass worn smooth by time. This was sacred ground to some of the older residents. They'd always said neutral ground where the living made peace with the dead. It was Mrs. Hebbert who saw it first. Her scream cut through the dying wind like a knife, high and sharp and utterly without hope. Ira followed her pointing finger to where something pale gleamed among the dark roots, something that caught the last grey light of the storm and held it like a promise. Bones, human bones wrapped in the cypress's ancient embrace like a lover's arms. The skeleton was small, delicate, a man, she thought, though time and earth had claimed most of the clothing. But there, still clutched in finger bones gone brown with age, was something that made Ara's blood run cold with recognition. A harmonica, silver, handcrafted with an intricate pattern of musical notes etched into its surface that she'd seen before in her grandmother as old photographs and the yellowed newspaper clippings she'd found in the attic. "Don't touch nothing," Mrs. Hebbert whispered, backing away like the bones might rise up and chase her. "This is bad business, Ara. Bad, bad business." But Ara was already moving closer, her historian's instincts overriding the primal fear that told her to run. She'd spent a decade cataloguing artifacts in climate-controlled museums, treating the past like a puzzle to be solved, rather than a living thing that could reach out and grab you by the throat. The harmonica was definitely pre-war, probably 1940s based on the craftsmanship. And that pattern, those musical notes, she'd seen them before in a photograph her grandmother kept hidden in her jewelry box. A photograph of a young black man with kind eyes and gifted hands, standing beside this very tree when it was in its prime. Silas Blackwood, the bluesman who'd vanished without a trace in 1948, leaving behind nothing but stories and songs that the old-timers still hummed when they thought nobody was listening. The man who could make a harmonica weep like a woman or laugh like a child depending on his mood. The man who'd supposedly run off with some girl from New Orleans, breaking hearts and promises in equal measure. Except he hadn't run anywhere at all. He'd been here all along, buried in the embrace of the tree that had watched over Port Amanda since before any of them were born, murdered most likely, and hidden where no one would think to look. The realization hit like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her knees weak. "Call the sheriff," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Hebbert was already shaking her head. "Sheriff Miller ain't going to want to hear about this child. Some things better left buried." But Ara was already pulling out her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed. This was bigger than a family crisis or a damaged house. This was history. Real history. The kind that got written in blood and buried in lies. For the first time since she'd returned to Port Amanda, she felt something other than resignation. She felt purpose. The bones of Silas Blackwood had waited 75 years for someone to find them. They could wait a little longer for justice. Sheriff Miller arrived 40 minutes after her call, his patrol car moving through the flooded streets like a funeral barge. He was a man built for comfort rather than confrontation, with the kind of soft belly and gentle eyes that made people trust him instinctively. Ara had known him since childhood. He'd been her grandfather's hunting partner and her grandmother's. Bridge opponent, practically family, which made his dismissal of the skeleton all the more chilling. "Old bones, darling," he said, crouching beside the root ball with the practiced disinterest of a man who'd seen too much and cared too little. Could be anybody. Could be some vagrant from the Depression, some drifter who died of natural causes and got himself a burial nobody remembered. Hell, could be from the Civil War for all we know. But Ara knew better. She'd photographed the harmonica before he arrived, capturing the intricate musical notation etched into its surface. Those weren't random decorations. They were bars from Cypress Moon, Silas Blackwood's signature song, the one the old-timers said could make angels weep and devils dance. She'd heard her grandmother hum it countless times, usually late at night, when the pain medication made her forget to guard her tongue. "I think it's Silas Blackwood," she said, watching Miller's face carefully. "The musician who disappeared in 1948. Something flickered behind his eyes, quick as summer lightning, fear maybe, or recognition. Silas Blackwood ran off with some Creole girl from the quarter. Everybody knows that story. Left his poor wife and daughter high and dry, never looked back. "But what if he didn't?" Ara pressed. "What if something happened to him right here on this land?" Miller's laugh was forced, hollow as an empty church. "Honey, you've been living in the city too long. Got your imagination all worked up. This is Port Amand, not some crime novel. People don't just get themselves murdered and buried under trees." But his words rang false, and they both knew it. Port Amand might be dying slowly, might be losing its children to bigger cities and better opportunities. But it had the same capacity for violence as any other place, maybe more, given how the isolation could twist people, make them desperate and cruel in equal measure. Miller had the bones removed by the next morning, claiming jurisdiction over what he called unidentified remains of historical interest. No investigation, no forensic analysis, just a quick transfer to the parish morgue where they'd sit in a drawer until everyone forgot they existed. The harmonica disappeared with them, swallowed by the same bureaucratic darkness that had claimed Silas himself. Ara spent the following days at the town hall, drowning her frustration in dusty record books and microfilm readers. Her archival training served her well here, teaching her to read between the lines of official documents, to spot the gaps and inconsistencies that revealed more than the words themselves. The story of Port Amande's salvation was written in those records. A tale of sudden prosperity that saved the town from the economic collapse that had claimed so many others during the post-war agricultural crisis. The Vance family mill had been the cornerstone of that recovery. Built in 1949 on a prime piece of land along the bayou where the soil was rich and the water rights were clear. Ara's grandfather, Thomas Vance, had supposedly purchased the land from a consortium of investors, but the more she dug, the stranger the transaction became. The original deed showed the land belonging to one S. Blackwood, with a purchase agreement dated just weeks after Silas's disappearance. But there was no record of the sale being completed, no transfer of funds, no signatures beyond her grandfather's bold scrawl. It was theft, pure and simple, legal theft maybe, hidden behind bureaucratic language and official stamps, but theft nonetheless. And it had made the Vance family rich, while Silas Blackwood rotted beneath the cypress tree that had once shaded his front porch. The revelation hit like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her hands shake as she held the copied documents. Everything she'd believed about her family, about her grandfather's business acumen and moral character, was built on a foundation of lies. The mill that had paid for her education, the house she'd grown up in, the comfortable life that had allowed her to pursue her passion for history, all of it purchased with blood money. She drove home in a daze, her mind reeling with implications and accusations. Her grandmother was having one of her lucid days, sitting on the back porch despite the lingering damage from the storm, watching the sunset paint the bayou in shades of gold and crimson. These moments of clarity were becoming rarer, precious as pearls, in an ocean of confusion. "Mama," Ara said, settling into the chair beside her, "I found some old papers about Grandpa's mill, about how he got the land." Her grandmother's eyes sharpened, the fog lifting like morning mist. She studied Ara's face with the intensity of a woman who'd learned to read between the lines of her own failing memory. "You know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Ara showed her a photograph she'd found in the Historical Society's files, a picture of her grandfather at the mill's grand opening. He looked proud, triumphant, surrounded by town dignitaries and smiling families. The man she'd idolized, the patriarch who'd built their legacy from nothing. Her grandmother stared at the image for a long moment, her weathered fingers tracing the outline of his face. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of 70 years of guilt and silence. "The music stopped," she whispered, and for a moment Ara thought she'd slipped back into confusion, but her eyes remained clear, focused. That night in 48, when the storm came through, the music just stopped, and we all pretended not to notice, but the devil got his due in the end. Always does. That evening, while her grandmother slept fitfully upstairs, Ara searched her grandfather's old study with the methodical precision of a professional archivist. The room had been sealed since his death 15 years ago, preserved like a shrine to his memory. But hidden behind a loose board in his desk, she found what she was looking for, a leather-bound ledger filled with entries in her grandfather's careful handwriting, coded payments, cryptic references, initials instead of names, and throughout it all, recurring mentions of the Cypress Man and debts that could never be repaid. The final entry was dated October 13th, 1948, 3 days after Silas Blackwood was reported missing. It contained just 4 words written in her grandfather, steady hand. The music has stopped. The ledger became Ara's obsession. Its coded pages spread across her grandmother's dining room table like the fragments of a shattered mirror. Each entry told a piece of the story, but the whole remained frustratingly out of reach. Thomas Vance had been careful, paranoid even, referring to people by initials and locations, by landmarks that no longer existed. But patterns emerged through the methodical application of archival detective work. The same skills that had made her reputation in academic circles now turned toward exposing her own family sins. The payments were substantial and regular, flowing from her grandfather's accounts to men identified only as MB and LT and RH, initials that corresponded to the founding families of Portamande, the Boudreau clan who ran the general store, the Thibodeau family who controlled the fishing boats, the Héberts who owned most of the residential property, all of them bound together by shared guilt and mutual silence. Their prosperity built on the same bloody foundation as her own family's mill. Ara began her investigation with the delicacy of a surgeon, approaching the elderly matriarchs of these families under the guise of compiling a historical record for the town's upcoming sesquicentennial celebration. She presented herself as the dutiful granddaughter, home to care for family, while contributing her professional expertise to preserving Portamande's heritage. The lies came easily, wrapped in academic terminology and seasoned with just enough genuine enthusiasm to seem authentic. Mrs. Marie Boudreau, 83 and sharp as a fishing knife, received her in a parlor that smelled of camphor and old secrets. The woman's eyes were pale blue and utterly without warmth, studying Ara like a specimen pinned to a board. Historical project, you say? How nice, though I can't imagine what stories an old woman like me could tell that would interest anyone. But when Ara mentioned Silas Blackwood, asking innocuous questions about the music scene in post-war Portamande, Mrs. Boudreau's demeanor shifted like the weather before a storm. That name's not one we speak much around here, child. Some folks are better left forgotten, especially those who abandon their responsibilities to chase after worldly pleasures. The response was too practiced, too uniform when repeated by Evangeline Thibodeau and Ruth Hébert in their respective parlors. The same careful phrasing, the same subtle redirection away from specifics, as if they'd all been reading from the same script for 75 years. When Ara pressed harder, asking about land ownership records and business partnerships from the 1940s, the temperature in each room seemed to drop by degrees. "Some roots are better left in the mud, dear," Mrs. Hebert told her, the woman's arthritic fingers worrying the crucifix around her neck, especially when digging them up might disturb the living along with the dead. The warning was delivered with a grandmother's smile, but the threat underneath was unmistakable. Portamande had survived by keeping its secrets buried, and anyone foolish enough to start excavating would find themselves alone in the dark with a very long shovel. The sabotage began subtly with small frustrations that could easily be attributed to the town's crumbling infrastructure. The microfilm reader at the library developed a persistent malfunction that made half the newspaper archives unreadable. The Historical Society's files suffered water damage from a burst pipe that flooded their storage room, destroying decades of photographs and documents. When Ara requested records from the parish courthouse, she was told they'd been transferred to a facility in Baton Rouge that was undergoing renovation and would not be accessible for months. The car accident happened on a Tuesday evening as she drove home from another fruitless interview, this one with the grandson of a man whose initials appeared frequently in her grandfather's ledger. The road between Portamande and the highway had always been treacherous, narrow and winding, through sections of swamp where the cypress trees grew thick as prison bars. She was navigating a particularly sharp curve when the pickup truck came up behind her, its high beams flooding her mirrors with blinding light. The impact came without warning, a tremendous blow to her rear bumper that sent her sedan spinning off the asphalt and down the muddy embankment toward the dark water. She managed to avoid the bayou by inches, her car coming to rest against a massive oak tree with her airbags deployed and blood running from a cut on her forehead. By the time she climbed out and looked back at the road, the pickup was gone, vanished into the Louisiana night like it had never existed at all. Sheriff Miller arrived with the tow truck, his face a mask of professional concern that didn't quite hide the satisfaction in his eyes. Dangerous stretch of road that, especially at night when folks might not be paying as much attention as they should. Good thing you weren't hurt worse. It was Benoit who found her the next morning, sitting on her back porch with a cup of coffee and a head full of doubts. He emerged from the swamp like something out of local folklore, pole-thin and weathered dark by decades of sun and solitude. Most people in Portamande avoided him, crossing the street when they saw him coming and whispering stories about his strange ways and stranger knowledge. But his grandfather had been Clarence Thibodeau, Silas Blackwood's closest friend and the only man in town who'd tried to raise questions about the musician's disappearance. "Heard you've been asking about Silas," he said without preamble, settling onto the porch steps like he belonged there. His voice carried the musical cadence of the bayou, words flowing like water over stones. "Heard you've been stirring up mud that's been settled for a long time." Ara studied his face, looking for signs of the same practiced deception she'd encountered everywhere else. But Benoit's eyes held only a deep, inherited sadness, and something that might have been hope. "I found his bones," she said simply, "under the cypress tree." "I know. Been waiting 75 years for somebody to find them. My grandfather never stopped looking, never stopped asking questions, right up until the day they found him face down in his fishing boat with his skull cracked open. Another accident, they said. Another unfortunate tragedy in a town full of them." Over the following hours, Benoit shared the stories his grandfather had passed down, oral histories that painted a picture very different from the official record. Silas Blackwood hadn't been just a musician. He'd been an engineer, self-taught but brilliant, with plans to transform the economic landscape of rural Louisiana. His land along the bayou had unique irrigation potential, and he'd envisioned a cooperative that would allow the area's sharecroppers to own their own farms instead of working someone else's soil for subsistence wages. The white landowners had seen the threat immediately. A successful black-owned cooperative would undermine the entire system that kept them wealthy and the workers dependent. They'd offered to buy Silas out, then threatened him when he refused. But he'd been stubborn, protected by his reputation and his genuine belief that progress was possible, even in a place like Portamande. They killed him during the Harvest Festival of 1948, when the town was loud with music and celebration, and a man's screams could be lost in the general chaos. Hanged him from his own cypress tree, then buried him beneath its roots, where he'd stay hidden until a storm finally brought the truth to light. The confrontation with Sheriff Miller happened on a Thursday morning that dawned grey and lifeless, the kind of day when even the bayou seemed to hold its breath. Ara had spent the previous night organizing her evidence, laying out photographs of the ledger entries, copies of the falsified land deeds, and Benoit's sworn statement about his grandfather's murder. She arranged it all with the precision of a prosecutor, building a case, each document a nail in the coffin of Portamande's carefully constructed lie. Miller arrived at her door with coffee and beignets from the general store, playing the role of the concerned family friend with the practiced ease of a career politician. He settled into her grandmother's kitchen like he owned it, his bulk filling the space with a casual authority that made her skin crawl. When she presented her evidence, spreading the documents across the table like tarot cards revealing an ugly future, his reaction was everything she'd expected and nothing she'd hoped for. "This is impressive work, sweetheart," he said, studying the papers with the detached interest of a man examining someone else's grocery list. "Real impressive. But it's also ancient history, and ancient history has a way of hurting people who don't deserve to be hurt." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a manila folder, setting it on the table with the careful deliberation of a chess player making a killing move. Inside was a legal document bearing the letterhead of Thibodeau, Boudreau and Associates, the only law firm in 3 parishes that still did business in Portamande. The paper was crisp and official, stamped with notary seals and signed in her grandmother's shaking handwriting. "Sworn affidavit," Miller explained, his voice gentle as a priest delivering last rites. "Your grandmother gave this statement 6 months ago, back when she was still having more good days than bad ones. Says right here that Silas Blackwood left town of his own free will in October of 1948. That she saw him packing his belongings and heard him talking about starting fresh somewhere new. Says she never saw any evidence of foul play, never heard any talk of violence or coercion." Ara stared at the document, her grandmother's signature wavering across the bottom like the handwriting of a woman drowning in her own failing mind. The words were precise, legal, and utterly damning to any hope of justice. Miller had played his hand perfectly, using her grandmother's illness as both sword and shield. "Of course, if you were to pursue this matter," he continued, his tone still conversational, still friendly, "there'd have to be questions about your fitness as a guardian. Woman with your grandmother's condition needs specialized care, professional supervision. State facility up in Alexandria has an excellent memory care unit, very secure, very safe. Be a shame if she had to spend her last days among strangers. But sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for everyone's protection." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke, poisoning everything it touched. Ara understood with crystalline clarity that she wasn't just being warned, she was being checkmated. The system wasn't designed to protect the innocent or punish the guilty. It was designed to protect itself, and it would sacrifice anyone who threatened its stability, including a confused old woman whose only crime was having a conscience. After Miller left, Ara sat in the kitchen for hours, staring at the evidence that had become meaningless as soon as he'd produced that affidavit. All her training, all her professional expertise, all her passion for historical truth, none of it mattered when faced with the brutal mathematics of power and vulnerability. She could expose the conspiracy and lose her grandmother, or she could stay silent and let the dead remain buried. There was no third option, no clever solution that would satisfy both justice and love. She began packing the next morning, each folded garment a small surrender to the forces that had ruled Portamande since before she was born. Her grandmother watched from her wheelchair with the clouded eyes of advancing dementia, sometimes recognizing Ara, and sometimes staring at her like she was a helpful stranger. The woman who had raised her, who had taught her to love books and question everything, was disappearing piece by piece, leaving behind only fragments of memory and moments of terrifying clarity. It was during one of those clear moments, while Ara cleaned out the bedroom closet, that her grandmother spoke with startling lucidity. "The tapes," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Don't forget the tapes." Ara found them in a cardboard box behind winter coats that hadn't been worn in years, a dozen reel-to-reel audio tapes labeled in her grandmother's younger handwriting. Most were dated from the early 2000s, when the first signs of memory loss had begun to manifest. Her grandmother had apparently decided to record her own stories before they disappeared entirely, creating an archive of her life for future generations. The first few tapes were mundane, filled with childhood memories and recipes and gossip about neighbors long dead. But tape number 7, dated December 15th, 2003, contained something that made Ara's hand shake as she adjusted the volume. Her grandmother's voice, 20 years younger but already touched with the fear of forgetting, spoke with the precision of a woman making a deathbed confession. "I need to tell someone about Silas Blackwood before I can't remember anymore. I need to say it out loud, even if nobody ever hears it. I was 19 years old, and I was there that night. I saw what they did." The recording continued for nearly an hour, her grandmother's voice growing stronger as the weight of 70 years of silence finally began to lift. She described the conspiracy in detail, naming names and providing specifics that no official document would ever contain. Thomas Vance hadn't just stolen Silas's land. He'd orchestrated the murder, convincing the other families that a successful black cooperative would destroy their way of life. They'd planned it during the harvest festival when the town was drunk and distracted, hanging Silas from his own tree before burying him in a grave that would never be marked. But the most shocking revelation came near the end of the tape when her grandmother's voice dropped to a whisper, heavy with decades of regret. Silas had suspected the danger, she said. In the weeks before his death, he'd made preparations, recording his music and documenting his engineering plans on a series of master records. He'd given them to Clarence Thibodeau for safekeeping, trusting his closest friend to preserve his legacy if something happened to him. Clarence never got the chance to use them, her grandmother continued. They killed him too, made it look like an accident. But he was smart, that old man. He hid those records where nobody would think to look, passed the secret down to his grandson before he died. Benoit knows where they are. He's been waiting all these years for someone to ask the right questions. The tape ended with her grandmother sobbing, the sound of a woman who had carried an unbearable burden for far too long. Ara sat in the growing darkness of the bedroom, tears streaming down her face as she finally understood the true scope of the tragedy. This wasn't just about Silas Blackwood anymore. It was about her grandmother's desperate need for redemption, about honoring the conscience that had been buried beneath decades of fear and complicity. Ara found Benoit at dawn, pulling his pirogue through the mist-shrouded channels where the bayou ran deepest and the secrets lay buried in layers of silt and time. The recording of her grandmother's confession had played through the night, each repetition carving the truth deeper into Ara's consciousness until she understood that silence was no longer an option. Some debts could only be paid with revelation. Some ghosts could only be laid to rest with acknowledgement. She called his name across the water, her voice carrying through the Spanish moss like a prayer finally spoken aloud. He listened to the tape in the cramped cabin of his fishing shack, his weathered face impassive as her grandmother's voice filled the space between them with 75 years of suppressed guilt. When it finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, studying his hands as if they held answers to questions he'd been afraid to ask. Finally, he rose and moved to a corner of the cabin where fishing nets hung like abandoned dreams, their holes testament to decades of patient mending. Behind the nets, built into the wall itself, was a compartment so cunningly concealed that Ara would never have found it without guidance. Benoit's hands worked with the reverence of a priest handling sacred relics, removing boards that had been carefully fitted to look like permanent fixtures. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and preserved by the dry air of a space that had never known flooding, were the master recordings that Silas Blackwood had entrusted to his best friend just days before his murder. There were 12 records in total, each one labeled in Silas's careful handwriting with song titles and dates. But more importantly, there were blueprints rolled in waterproof tubes, engineering drawings that detailed irrigation systems decades ahead of their time, agricultural innovations that could have transformed the entire Mississippi Delta. Silas Blackwood hadn't just been a musician, he'd been a visionary, a man who understood that true freedom came through economic independence and sustainable prosperity. Ara held one of the records up to the light streaming through the cabin's single window, marveling at how something so fragile had survived when everything else had been destroyed. The wax surface gleamed like dark water, holding within its grooves the voice of a man who had been silenced but never truly defeated. This was his resurrection, his chance to speak across the decades and demand the justice that had been denied him in life. Instead of fighting Port Amandi's entrenched power structure through courts that would never listen and officials who would never care, Ara chose a different battlefield. She contacted Dr. Marcus Williams, a renowned musicologist at Tulane University, whose work on lost American folk traditions had earned him national recognition. Within hours of hearing Silas Blackwood's music, Williams was driving to Port Amande with recording equipment and barely contained excitement about what he called the most significant musical archaeological discovery of the 21st century. The story exploded across academic journals and music publications before spreading to mainstream media with the viral intensity of a truth whose time had finally come. Silas Blackwood's music was haunting, sophisticated, and utterly unique, the work of a genius who had absorbed influences from blues, jazz, and classical traditions to create something entirely new. But it was his engineering plans that truly captured the public imagination, technical drawings that demonstrated an understanding of sustainable agriculture that wouldn't become mainstream for another 50 years. Within weeks, major news networks were sending crews to Port Amanda, transforming the dying town into an unwilling stage for national conversations about racial violence, economic exploitation, and the long shadow of historical injustice. The Today Show filmed a segment at the cypress stump where Silas's body had been found. CNN interviewed Benoit about his family's decades-long guardianship of the hidden records. The Washington Post ran a 3-part investigative series that traced the connections between the 1948 conspiracy and the systemic suppression of black innovation throughout the American South. The founding families of Port Amande found themselves exposed to scrutiny they had never imagined possible. Marie Boudreau, Evangeline Thibodeau, and Ruth Hebert, the elderly matriarchs who had guarded their secrets for so long, discovered that wealth and local influence provided no protection against the judgment of history. Their carefully constructed narratives crumbled under the weight of evidence, their family names forever linked to a crime that had hidden in plain sight for 3/4 of a century. Sheriff Miller announced his retirement 3 days after the story went national, citing his desire to spend more time with his grandchildren. The official statement made no mention of the questions surrounding his role in suppressing the investigation, but everyone understood that his career in law enforcement was effectively over. There would be no criminal prosecutions. Too much time had passed. Too many witnesses were dead, but the truth itself had become a verdict that no legal system could overturn. Port Amande was forced into the kind of painful public reckoning that no community ever welcomes but some desperately need. Town meetings that had once been sleepy affairs, attended by a handful of retirees, suddenly drew crowds of reporters, activists, and citizens demanding accountability. A citizens' committee was formed to examine other suspicious deaths and disappearances from the town's past, their investigation guided by the terrible possibility that Silas Blackwood had not been the conspiracy's only victim. For Ara, the victory came at a cost that couldn't be measured in news coverage or public vindication. The grandfather she had idolized was revealed as a murderer. The family fortune she had inherited was exposed as blood money, and the home she had reluctantly returned to protect was forever tainted by its connection to unspeakable crimes. She lost the comfort of ignorance, the luxury of believing that her family's success had been earned through honest work and moral character. But she gained something more valuable than comfort, a sense of purpose that transcended personal loss and family loyalty. The Silas Blackwood Foundation was established 6 months after the story broke, funded by the substantial royalties generated by his newly released recordings. The foundation's mission was ambitious and specific, supporting young artists and engineers from marginalized communities, providing grants and resources to help them achieve the kind of success that had been denied to Silas himself. On a cool October morning, exactly 1 year after the cypress tree had fallen, Ara stood beside a bronze memorial plaque that now marked the spot where Silas Blackwood had been buried. The ceremony was small, attended mostly by local residents and a few journalists who had continued following the story. Benoit spoke about his grandfather's friendship with Silas, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd like music itself. A gospel choir from New Orleans performed Cypress Moon, Silas's signature song, their voices rising and falling like the tide that would eventually claim Port Amanda entirely. The plaque's inscription was simple: Silas Blackwood, 1922-1948, musician, engineer, visionary. Some voices can be silenced, but truth, like the bayou, always finds a way to the surface. It was not a monument to triumph, but a testament to the price of justice and the persistence of memory. Ara touched the bronze surface with her fingertips, feeling the weight of choices made and prices paid, understanding finally that some victories could only be measured in decades. Some healing could only happen when secrets were allowed to surface, and truth was given its proper name.